Hey, it's Clay. Welcome to another video. Today we are going to take an amplifier of mine. It's a single-ended EL34 based amp. Kind of the preamp initially was based on a Marshall Plexi. It's kind of sounding a little stagnant in my repertoire of amps. And one thing I've learned is if it's not being used, let's tinker with it till it finds a home, a tonal home in this palette of amps that I've got. I already have a big 50-watt Plexi, and so the little 7-watter just doesn't get used as much. And on the lower end, I've got kind of this cool single-ended 5-watt champ thing that I kind of did in a previous video that I also really like. It's got the parallel input tubes, and I just think that kind of suits this preamp a little bit better. So my thought is to take this puppy, and we're going to crank it up to 11. We're going to make it a high-gain amp, kind of inspired by a JCM800. So I'm going to do some circuit analysis, kind of look at a JCM800 style amp circuit and kind of tweak it though to my own taste. And really at the end of the day, it's going to be kind of a new, unique hybrid type of amp that maybe has never quite been built like this before. So if you're curious about that process, go ahead and stick around and let's dive in. Okay, so I will leave some links in the description below. I've got a whole video series on how I built this amp. I've got a TDPRI thread here if you want to take a look. But the basics of this amp is it's a little single-ended amp, but most single-ended guitar amps are like 6v6 or EL34, little 5-watters. But this guy I actually built with an EL34 for about 7 to 10 watts of output power. So it's going to have a little bit more headroom, a little bit more capability than the little 5-watters, which are mostly just bedroom amps, whereas I think a single-ended EL34 can absolutely produce a little more headroom and clean tone and just power, but you still get some of that fun single-endedness in the power section. And then I've got two preamp tubes, 12AX7s in the preamp. This is the schematic that I ended up with when I was done with that project. So just kind of walk through it a little bit. We've got an input jack here going into this would be kind of like your grid stopping resistor, but then it's internally jumpered. So both the bright and the normal channels are internally jumpered in the preamp, whereas usually on a Plexi, you'd have 4 inputs, and then you could jumper them with a little patch cable. But instead of that, I just did it this way. In hindsight, I don't know if I would need like 33K on the inputs, but the grid, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. From there, you've got the normal bass channel going into the grid, into the plate. Our caps here, we got a big cathode bypass cap for all the bass. Got a pretty average size 0.02 UF decoupling cap into a volume control, into a mixing resistor. That's going to basically let all of the low frequencies pass through to make a relatively dark channel. Conversely, on the bright side, we got a much smaller cap, go from 25 microfarads down to 0.47. We've got a different plate resistor and also a different cathode resistor, 100K versus 220K, 820 ohm versus 3K, just so that they're biased a little bit differently. Kind of thought that would be interesting. But then we got a much smaller decoupling cap. So this cap and this cap are going to make this signal much brighter into a volume control, and then the mixing resistor. And I do have a little 500 picofarad to bypass that thing to, again, make this channel. So this channel is going to be very bright. This channel is going to be very dark. And then you mix between the two with these two normal volumes. From there, it's regular Plexi stuff. We've got right in here, this is our cathode follower. Well, first just a gain stage and then a cathode follower with some Merlin Blendco mods. And then in here, we've got our Plexi tone stack, a master, and then all of that feeds into this single-ended EL34 into an output transformer. Solid-state diodes for the rectifier, and some pretty just boring standard step-down B+ supply stuff. What instead I want to do is the jump to a JCM800, and to pause here, if you're curious about this, I have a video on my YouTube channel where I went in great detail about the evolution of the Bassman to the JTM45 to the Plexi to the JCM800. And so please check that out if you're curious. But basically, instead of having these two parallel paths, instead what you could do is run on the input to 1, cut this out, and instead of going through here and mixing at this phase, instead what you could do is run this guy back to the input here, go through this gain stage. So you're basically running these two inputs in series, one into the next, cascaded, as opposed to running them in parallel, where they split and then rejoin. That would be the Plexi. And to give an example of that, this is Rob Robinette's JCM800 6v6. I like this schematic just because it's really pretty and easy to look at. And if we go over here to the preamp, I think you'll see exactly what I just described, where you have an input jack, a high gain input jack, going into this, coming out of decoupling cap right here, into the low input jack, which runs into a little gain control, grid, plate, a little bit of signal attenuation here, into our cathode follower, into our tone stack, into a long tail pair phase inverter. Now, I think this is just going to be kind of a fun project. So I'm basically going to take, instead of having these parallel paths that join here, we're going to run them in series. Now, this is not a JCM800. I think part of the JCM800 experience is going to be, the power section is really important to that amp. You've got a lot of very recognizable traits. First of all, long tail pair phase inverter. That's going to add a gain that I will not have. A long tail pair phase inverter is kind of like having an extra triode gain stage. And then you've got push pull. That amp would probably have bigger, like 50 watt. So like push pull 6 L6s or push pull EL34s. This one has 6v6s. So a lot more of the output section is meant to be more clean, high headroom, and then a lot of the tone shaping and the distortion is generated here in the preamp. And I'm not going to have that. My power section can be a little bit dirtier because I'm running only 7 to 10 watts single-ended. But I think that's an interesting kind of a higher gain little amp to mess around with. I think it could be kind of fun. And frankly, a lot of the guys, when I see the JCM800s, they run the masters really, really low anyways. So even though you have extra gain in the phase inverter and a lot more headroom in the power section, they don't necessarily seem to be using it as much. So I'm curious about that. Some other thoughts I have is the preamp of the JCM800 has the use of the capacitors here is definitely contributing to its signature sound. So let's look at those a second. We got 0.68 microfarad here. That's going to trim a little bit of bass. Pretty standard decoupling. Then right here, we've got this section right here is something I want to spend a lot of time with experimenting. So let's talk about it. So from a resistor perspective, you've got 470k ohms, which is going to suppress the signal into a volume control. Now what this means is so this is your wiper. When you of your preamp gain volume, when you move it up to maximum, you're basically right here. But you're still going to have this 470k. So you're always dumping a little bit of signal to ground. But secondary importance, and to pause there, you probably want that. You want a little bit of gain control in between these stages. If you just run a max out with no attenuation whatsoever, no voltage dividers, no volume controls, you're going to have way too much gain. You're going to overwhelm this thing pretty quickly. A lot of higher gain amplifiers is about cascading gain in appropriate mounts and while also controlling it. So that's what these resistors and the pot does. Second, though, we have to talk about these two caps. These are like bright caps. So what this means is when the signal hits this 470k resistor, it gets attenuated. It's like it's slowed down. But then over here is kind of like the commuter lane on the highway, where high frequencies that pass the 470 picofarad threshold, it's going to set like a high pass filter. Anything that passes 470 picofarads can just bypass the 470k of resistance. It's like taking the fast lane on the highway. But then you got another one, a second bright cap right here, and this one is even bigger. 0.001 microfarads is like 1,000 picofarads, I think, and that means even more. And you have even more resistance, 1 milliamp. So you have tremendous bright caps, both in series, making this part of the preamp quite bright, quite aggressive, a lot going on to generate clipping, especially in the higher frequencies. So your mid-range and your bass are being attenuated with these resistors, and then your treble just gets the fast lane all the way to the grid. A third bright cap here, this 470 picofarad on this next gain stage. So again, a lot of brightness. Also to be aware is you've got some interesting use of these resistors here. We have unbypassed resistors that are completely opposite in how they are biased. This is a 10K cold clipper, and then this is an 820 ohm warm clipper, warm bias, not really clipper. And this is super interesting because if you're not familiar with a cold clipper, this is kind of what it's like. So imagine your sine wave. This is your guitar signal. It's come out of this first gain stage. It's gotten amplified. The cold clipper, if you center bias, if this resistor here is like 1.5K, that's probably a center bias. That means that your bias or your midpoint is going to be right in the center. So your signal can swing freely up and down on both sides. However, if instead you use 10K, your signal is still going to swing like this, but your center bias line is going to be so very negative that what that means is, and I could be getting negative and positive mixed around, but the general idea is correct. What that means is your signal only has so much room to swing until it runs out of headroom and starts to clip. Well, if we imagine the clipping point as the black lines, you can see here that when it swings up, this whole portion of the waveform gets clipped and clipped aggressively. But then when it swings down, you still have headroom right here. And so the signal is only clipping asymmetrically when the half of the waveforms is getting clipped and getting clipped quite aggressively. That's what the 10K cold clipper does. Next, the next thing to be mindful of is when your signal goes from the grid to the plate, it inverts, it flips. So what was the positive waveform now becomes negative. So if your signal was going up, now it's going down. And then over here, when the positive got clipped, now the negative will be super clipped. And then the interesting thing is this next resistor, this one, the 820 ohm, this is a very warm bias. So you're actually shoving the center line up even. So if it was here, now it's like even down here. So you're even further reinforcing that clipping. A very fascinating preamp. The last, I've already said that a couple times, but the next comment I want to make is that both of these resistors are unbypassed. Right here, you got a bypass cap. A bypass cap does tremendous to like remove, I forget what the term is, but it's like removing congestion and bloat in the triode, at increasing gain significantly. But neither of these triodes are bypassed. And so that asymmetrical clipping unbypassed is also a big part of the sound. However, this is absolutely something that you could play around with. Instead of doing cold clipper, warm clipper, you could do two 1.5K center bias resistors and then bypass them with capacitors. And then, so once you start tweaking with all these things, if you're going to mess with these two bright caps, this one, and if you're going to mess with these resistors, now you're really starting to tinker with the core DNA of a JCM800, and you're shifting into a much different type of amplifier altogether. But those are things I'd like to explore. I am not really very beholden to the stock JCM800. Frankly, I'm not really that interested in it because I think the way that it's set up pushes the amp more into the heavy rock metal territory. And I live more in maybe the classic rock blues territory. But these are things I'd like to experiment with and play around with. Maybe put them on a switch. it would be interesting to put these resistors. Why does this thing get bigger and bigger every time? It'd be very interesting to put these resistors on a switch so you have access to both the stock JCM800 sound and then also the modified sound. So some things I want to mess around with. So let's stop talking. I hope that this has been interesting and enlightening. I'm going to pause and probably quit the video here because this is more of the theoretical, what I plan to do. This is the roadmap. Let's close it down here. My next video, I would like to actually pop open the amp, take a look at it, do a little bit of inventory of where it's at, and then also start this modification. And I don't think it's going to be that complicated. Okay, this is the input of the 7-watt Plexi. And looking at this thing, this is a good amp, but there certainly are some build techniques that I would not repeat. So what I ended up doing is, with all the circuitry in this section, I just pulled it all out. And we're going to freshen it up. Some of these wires are fine, like these two decoupling caps and these plate resistors, but everything else needs to come out. So I got my input jack. I got a 20K resistor. We're going to go input jack into the grid of this first gain stage. Just a little detail here. This resistor, I've got some rubber sheathing on here just to protect it from contacting stray signals. Then you can see my input jack. And right in the middle here, you can see I've got a J-hook where it's firmly around the lug, but it's not so wicked tight that you can't take it off. One thing, when I first started soldering, I would say I didn't make physical connections good enough. I would just kind of like loop the wire in the hole generally and then lather it with solder. That was not a good idea. But then as I evolved from there, I started like double, triple, like I would wrap the lead around the hole like several times, and then that just makes it like unserviceable because the only option is to just rip the component out and put in a new one. So this method with the J-hook gives you kind of the best of both worlds, where it's a firm physical connection, but it's also easily repairable. Okay, we've got this lead running here to pin 2, which is the grid. Again, another J-hook. A little bit of solder. You can see how it soldered up here, covered the entire hole, but overall nice and clean. Next, we've got a resistor also on the hot leg to ground. Alright, so we've got pin 1, the plate is done. Pin 2, the grid is done. Then pin 3 here is the cathode. I've got a 3K resistor and a 1 microfarad bypass cap. So I think the schematic would call for slightly different values, 2.7K and 0.68 microfarad. I am going with these values, and I'm fine with it. Okay, so now we got a point of divergence. We've gone input jack, grid, our cathode is done. We're coming out of the plate, which is right here, through this decoupling cap to here. This is now, instead of routing to the volume control, it's going through a little bit of a grid leaking resistor or grid stopping resistor with a cap over top to bypass some of those treble frequencies. Now, so this is 430K and this is 250 picofarads. I think the schematic calls for 470 picofarads and 470K. Resistor's really close, and that's fine. This is definitely 250. We're cutting the capacitor in half, so it's going to be less of an effective bright cap, so to speak, which I'm coming into this with some suspicion that I don't think I'm really going to like the bright cap. So already making some modifications. Then we go to this terminal here into the preamp gain control. We're going to go out of the preamp gain control back over here, whereas before it went over here to this next stage. We're got to go back this way, but this is my tone stack stuff. So before we get there, we got to run into this next area. Okay, so now we're on this far gain stage. We got this red wire here going into the grid. I've got the plate, 100K resistor, and then I got this resistor here going from the cathode down to ground. I put in a 15K resistor. The JCM800 would call for a 10K. There's some others that would increase it, like a Soldano would push it all the way up to like a 39K. So continue with my theme where I'm kind of in the ballpark, but tweaking it a little. This resistor here will bias this stage very, very cold, called the cold clipper. And it's interesting. I actually I'm kind of curious, and one thing I maybe would like to try is actually putting this cathode resistor on a switch and having one side be like the 10K or the 15K cold clipper, and maybe having the other side be like 2K, also though with a cathode bypass capacitor. So you have much more of a neutral bias, but then also the bypass cap will give it a lot more gain. I'm not sure this amp is going to need more gain, so we're going to try it like this, but that's what I've got. From there, I go through this decoupling cap, which follows this wire over here. I've got two resistors. These I think are 360K. Their schematic calls for 470, but I ran out of those. But the ratio between the two will still set a 50% voltage divider. So the signal comes into this green, goes through the one resistor, half the signal gets dumped to ground, and half the signal follows the red wire to the grid of this stage here. Then this is all of my cathode follower. That's going to remain unchanged. And then I go to the tone stack. All right, my circuit exits the cathode follower here. And I don't mean to skip over the cathode follower, but I'll leave a link in the description. I did some mods from Merlin Blenco's book on preamps. You can see I got like a diode here. I basically just copied that cathode follower. I go into here. I'm actually running a 56K slope resistor. That is a resistor you could potentially play around with, or maybe even put it on a switch. Some fun stuff to be had there with that. That really affects how the tone stack operates in general. Kind of shifts the mid-range around. But we got 500 picofarads here to the treble. We got 0.02 microfarads here for the bass pot. And then we got another 0.02 here to the mid-range pot. I got a 25K mid-range pot here. Got to run this to ground through this wire. And then the tone stack is going to be good to go. Okay, I think we're pretty much done. Got my mid-range control. Cap coming in the middle. The bass pot ties in here. And then the ground goes right there. Come out of the treble into a master volume. Master volume is grounded here. Then we run over here. This is my power tube. I got a little bit of a grid stopping resistor in there. But then other than that, this power tube is fine. I don't need to make any adjustments there. Still got my 4 and 8 ohm taps. I could maybe add another one for this gray. It's probably 16 ohms. Just sitting there doing nothing. But yeah, these filter caps are still good. My B+ supply is still good. Got diode rectifiers. This thing is fine. Let's just fire it up, see if it works. Okay, this is the schematic that I have kind of left us off with. I'm going to say this is like in the ballpark of a JCM800. Certainly is, there's some meaningful changes. Specifically there's no bright cap here on the gain control, and then this bright cap over this resistor has been reduced. This cathode bias resistor, the cold clipper, went from 10K to 15K. I'm sure there's other changes throughout here. But I played with the amp a little bit. We've heard some tone clips. To me, in my ears, it sounds and feels like a Marshall JCM800. It's got some of that kind of aggressive top end. Fun amp, very cool amp to play. But, the JCM800 thing is not exactly what I am looking for in an amp. And so this is kind of the proposal that I'm going to make to move this amp in that direction. The input here is pretty much, the same. We've got a little bit of bass trimming here on the 1 microfarad cathode bypass cap. Pretty standard 100K, 2.7K, 0.022. I did take off any of the bright caps here in this intermediate stage. This is going to definitely reduce some of that high-end aggression, that Marshall sound. A lot of that kind of zingy high-end treble is going to be taken away. This is going to smooth the amp out quite a bit. Then again, on the second gain stage, I've got a 3K bias resistor with a 1 microfarad cathode bypass cap. So both of these 1 microfarad caps and this 2.7K or 3K bias resistor are going to set these gain stages to trim a little bit of bass. But adding the bypass cap and bringing this resistor down means it's much less of a cold clipper, and it's going to have quite a bit more gain because it's cathode bypassed. Up here, I got another smoothing cap here, 100 picofarads across this resistor. This is going to dump some really high frequencies into the power supply. And so, again, smoothing it out. So by removing the bright caps and by this use of caps here, I'm basically trimming both bass and treble into another gain pot. Now, I added a second gain stage here, 100K. This actually, 100K is not right. It needs to be more like 500K or 1 meg. But, to me, when you have a fixed, if we go back to the old one, in here, these two 360s, again with another bright cap, which I have again removed, but these two fixed 360s just make a 50%, volume to ground. Like, it's as if you have a volume control and it's set at 50%. To me, that never has made a ton of sense. So by adding a pot in here, I want to have some ability to change the amount of voltage divider going on here. So, yeah, I think for my money, this is an interesting and a fun addition, but I do need to experiment with the value of this pot. Then another gain stage here to drive into the cathode follower. I've got another 3K bias resistor with a 1 microfarad decoupling cap. So basically all three of these gain stages now have cathode bypass caps. I go back into this safety diode here to prevent blowback under the plate, and then I've got my pretty standard tone stack. So, and then all that goes into an EL34. Yeah, lot to like here. I think this amp is going to bring it into a much more of a smoother, warmer, I'm going to dare I use the word bluesier, but a very much a high gain amp. So let's tinker with these mods and then let's see how it sounds. All right, I got the amp up on the bench, and my version of all the mods are complete and implemented. Pretty excited about this. And yeah, pretty much all the bright caps are gone. Some of the cathode bypass caps have tightened it up a little bit. Curious to see how this plays out. Let's go ahead and get this puppy fired up, listen to it, see how it sounds. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. This build has been a ton of fun for me to mess around with. Some of these high gain type concepts are just interesting, and they're a little more challenging as an amp builder and a designer, because you have to be a little bit more careful and cautious about how you put the gain stages together and where specifically you use capacitors to really change the tonality of the amp. I think that where this amp ended up got to a place that I really enjoy, but to be straight up honest, this thing is a very far cry from a JCM800. So I know the title will probably reference a JCM800, but what this amp is at the end of the day is really not in the JCM800 world. I think a big part of that is because I'm not using the bright caps that it has in between that first and second gain stage. Mine is much smoother, and I'm quite a bit happier with how that turned out. So overall, I think my preamp is higher gain by using cathode bypass caps, getting rid of the cold clipper, but it's not, the cold clipper and the bright caps I think are really key to the sound of the JCM800. That's why it's so aggressive and so just strident and just that rock sound. I think where this amp ended up is quite a bit more neutral in terms of clipping, more symmetrical, but I think it's a lot warmer and it's a lot just rounder and more of a blues sound than more of a metal sound, if that makes sense to you guys. So, which is exactly where I would want this amp to live. I think this amp is a ton of fun. This would be an amp, when you're wanting, I have not strayed away from playing with higher gain tones at some of my live shows. So I'm curious to maybe bring this thing out and play it with my band and see how it works with that. It would be a really different experience because they'd have to really rely on cleaning up with the volume control, but I think that could be a lot of fun. So please let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below, how you think this amp came out. If you have any other suggestions or anything that you would do, please let me know down below. See you again soon. Thanks. Bye.